when we're doing inequality, I would just narrow it all down into just the causes of inequality, the pros and cons of inequality or the evaluations of it, and then the policies to reduce inequality, and it will make everything way easier. So when we're doing, I'm basically just going to list out the causes and we can discuss them as we go. Okay. How are wage differentials a cause of inequality?
Well, if you have like a higher MRP, that causes you to have higher skills and therefore a higher paying job. You can
Perfect.
probably
Yeah, and I should
pay
have
for more
phrased my question
healthcare.
better. Yeah, I should have phrased my question better. Let's actually just jump because wage differentials are self-explanatory as to why they're a source of inequality. So my better question would be, is that fair or good or bad? And what are the reasons why that's a good thing and a bad thing? So what are the pros and cons of wage differentials?
Well, would appropriate causes like incentives to increase your skills or get into a more suitable job for you?
Yeah, good. So wage differentials create incentive. Another one is that wage differentials might be deserved. This bit's really important. Um, because if you have a heart surgeon earning 100 or 200,000 pounds a year, and you have a somebody else earning 30,000 pounds a year, the heart surgeon is doing a really valuable and important job, and their MRP is really high, and their supply is really, really low because there's not many of them, and they need a lot of rest in between shifts as well. So therefore, the market forces mean that it's fair that that person gets a high wage. And then you can link it to the second point of it creating incentives for there to potentially be more heart surgeons in the future, if that's where demand is. So that's like a really important reason for why inequality exists and why it doesn't need to be resolved. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we carry on with the causes, the number one disadvantage with inequality, okay, is that it has a lot of negative externalities. What I mean is just inequality can lead to things like crime, anxiety, stress, and things like that. Um, and another thing is that inequality is also a burden on the taxpayer because the people who are earning lower amounts of income actually contribute less to the tax system and also may require benefits. So inequality doesn't help anybody, either. And then the second reason why inequality is bad is that inequality causes more inequality. And that's linked to the other cause. So I think wealth inequality is one of the biggest causes of inequality because wealth inequality leads to people's kids having differing amounts, differing qualities of help and education. If somebody who's very wealthy has a child who's ill, um, they could go to a private medical center and also get private education during that time, and they won't miss out on any of their education. But somebody on low income would have a poorer quality of education, and if they get ill, they'll also have a poorer quality of healthcare, and that worsens inequality even more. And that links to the poverty trap, which is just about income, health, and education in a cycle. So people on lower incomes have worse health and education, and people who have worse health and education have worse incomes. What else? And then with wage differentials, you've also got unemployment and you've got poor quality of state provision. By the way, I forgot one point on the state provision thing. You know, from the other bit which we were doing about state provision, um, one thing about state provision, you know how there was, wait, what was the downside of state provision?
Excess demand
Yeah.
and
But
opportunity
what's
for.
so cool is that, you know how the quality is lower?
Mhm.
That means that those people who are so willing and able to pay for that thing and so fed up with the poor quality will actually go and pay for it. So people, that's why some people end up going to private schools, even when state schools exist. And that's why some people end up going to um um private medical, even when the NHS exists. So the market will still be there. It's not like nationalization. State provision is completely different. You're providing it free, but other people can still opt into a market if they want to. But yeah, in this context, poor quality of state provision can also worsen inequality. So if we've got poor NHS, underfunded NHS, or poor quality of schooling, then that would lead to a worse inequality. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, cool. The pros and cons really depend on what type of and cause of inequality we have, but I think in general, the main advantage is that it creates incentives and it might be fair or deserved. And then the main downside is that it leads to negative externalities and can worsen more inequality. One more negative, wait, actually, it would be better if I explain it through the policies. So one is always an option to leave it to the market, not because it's a policy, but because the question would ask about policies or also as just leaving it to the market. Um, what's the downside of leaving it to the market?
That's it. Like we said before with state provision, if it's a necessity, people that aren't like able to buy it but are willing won't get access to it. Sort of
Yeah.
thing.
It's about the willing and able in terms of the labor market. You can link it to, so a lot of inequality relates to labor market contexts. But also somebody who's yeah, so I like to just give a concrete and clear example of why it's not fair to leave, for example, a labor market in terms of willingness and ability, because some people are, for example, disabled people would struggle to compete in a labor market with other people, and that's not fair. So it's really, really important that things do not get completely left to the market, because the market is not perfect and wouldn't be able to help people who struggle. Um, what are the good things about mostly leaving things to the market?
Would it be like the market mechanism and how no excess demand and
In terms of
so?
inequality, though, how would you're right, but how would you like relate more to this context now? Like in the labor market?
So would it be about incentives?
Yeah,
Mm.
then that's when we link back everything we mentioned about the wage differential. So this stuff here. Okay, so you just think about the pros of inequality, whatever we said in that section, which are wage differentials being deserved and wage differentials creating incentives. Okay. And then you've got another nice concrete example of like a heart surgeon rightly earning more than somebody else. And I'll give you even more. So if we don't, and then the next thing I was going to say was progressive tax system, and it's going to link on nicely as well. So the pro of this, okay, is that it protects people who are on low incomes and struggle to get higher paid jobs. And the con of this is that it disincentivizes hard work of the heart surgeon. Okay.
Mhm.
Because that person might be earning quite a lot of money, but every extra shift he needs to work, he might potentially be earning a very, very low amount because every extra job he does on top of his current salary, he's being taxed over 50%. or 45%.
Mhm.
So it's really disincentivizing for him to work. And the Laffer curve shows us, okay, so we've got tax rate and we've got tax revenue, okay? So this is the optimal tax rate. But basically, when you keep on increasing the tax rate even further, people leave the country or people retire or people tax evade. Okay. So you're disincentivizing some really fundamental people like heart surgeons, and then they might just move to Australia or America to work there. So there's so many like further downsides with something like that. So it's really important not to tax too high, but also there has to be some form of redistribution because some people are um need the redistribution more than others. Um, then there's only two more. Uh, there's inheritance tax. You can definitely use a lot of common sense for this. And you can mention that it solves the problem of wealth inequality. And in my opinion, I was mentioning earlier that wealth inequality causes income inequality. So you could use that as your chain of reasoning. So if you increase inheritance tax, you reduce wealth inequality and you reduce income inequality. So there's a nice chain of reasoning there. Provision of information can be used in some cases. For example, in the labor market to reduce wage discrimination. So if you actually think back to 20 or 30 years ago, women were paid less than men in a lot of different industries. And over time, there's just been a lump of provision of information over and over and over again. And now, say if you have a male and a female doctor, they'd be earning the same amount. So there's a real life example of how provision of information works, and it can increase demand for labor in the case of discrimination. Okay.
Mhm.
Last two, state provision, which I'm not going to go into because we already talked about that. But increasing so even in terms of the excess demand of state provision, you could even further increase state provision to make it even more like just put more funding towards it. And then you could increase the quality of the health and the education system to make it literally the best possible health and education system there is. And then that would significantly reduce inequality because not many people would have an excuse to of poor education or poor healthcare. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Could use the same chains of reasoning which we've done before. And then the final one is a minimum wage, and that's the best paragraph to do. And it's really, really worth practicing because it could be used in so many cases in terms of labor markets or also in terms of inequality. And you've got the minimum wage causing excess demand, and you've got the evaluation that a minimum wage has a different impact in monopoly markets where it doesn't cause unemployment.